On here. All right. And we are ready to go. So this is dormant fruit tree pruning. Hopefully that's what you thought you were signing up for. And I am Dean Gunderson. I'm the Director of Education at Seed St. Louis. If you knew Gateway Greening in the past, we're the same people. We just changed our name last fall. So we do all the same stuff, same people. So first, I always like to kind of clarify or bring up the fact that, pruning is what everybody talks about. Pruning is like the big thing with fruit trees that people are like, I don't know how to do it. It's intimidating. I want to make sure I do it right. And I always like to clarify that pruning is the cutting of branches, which most people know. It's when you're like cutting a branch off at some point. But pruning is just a tactic to accomplish the actual goal. So pruning is one of several different ways that you can train your trees. And training is what we're really trying to do. You're trying to train to a specific shape or structure or something. And pruning is just one of the ways to do that. So we'll talk about some of the other ways as well. So why trees are trained. So, again, like pruning is kind of a unique thing. Like you're not usually pruning with vegetables, although there are some vegetables that you'll do some pruning with. But like with fruit trees, it's like, a big thing that everybody talks about. So why are we actually doing that? So one of the primary reasons that we're doing it is because most of these like conventional fruit trees that you think about, like your apples, your pears, your peaches, your apricots, your cherries, most of them came from Central Asia, which has a continental climate similar to us, where it's really hot in the summer, really cold in the winter, but it's quite a bit drier. It's the humidity is much lower than it is here, and so these trees are not super well adapted to our incredible humidity in the summer, and so because of that, they're susceptible to a lot more diseases here than they would be in their where they were originally from, where they're originally adapted to. And people have pruned these trees for thousands of years at this point. They've really kind of pruned them since day one, as far as we can tell. Why they started it, I don't know, but they did. And so trees have kind of been bred to need that. These apples, these pears, these peaches, they just really don't respond well if you don't prune them. And so we're almost, to some degree, we're pruning them because we pruned them. So like it's kind of a self-made problem to some degree, but also the higher humidity here is definitely a reason for that. And so when we prune, we're doing it to increase airflow. So when you're like pruning out branches, when you're kind of thinning out the canopy, it's called, so that they're like less kind of leaf matter and stuff in there. It means that it's easier for air to flow in over the leaves and the branches that remain. And that also increases light penetration. Again, when there's less stuff in there, the stuff that's left is more likely to be hit by sun. And that increased airflow and increased sunlight is going to reduce the humidity in the canopy. When you have kind of a dark area that doesn't have a lot of airflow, and you have a tree which is releasing water, plants release water as part of photosynthesis, it's really humid in those leaves, like in the leaf area, and that higher humidity makes them more susceptible to disease. And so we're pruning to help kind of lower that humidity, which is going to help control disease. It also, and we'll talk about how this works more later, but pruning also helps to create a stronger structure for the tree. It makes sure that the branches that are left are going to be nice and like strongly attached to the tree, so it's less likely that in a storm you're going to have a branch break or crack or the trunk split in half, which are all things that can happen with trees. But pruning is a way to try and reduce the likelihood of that. And by creating a stronger structure and reducing disease, and by increasing sunlight in particular, you're also going to improve the fruit quality and the quantity. By getting that direct sun, you're going to get more fruit on the branches that remain, and more total fruit, believe it or not. If you have a tree that's completely unpruned, you're usually only going to see fruit kind of right on the edge of the tree, like on the edge of branches where those leaves are getting full sun. Whereas if you prune it so that you're getting sun to the interior of the tree, you're also going to get fruit in the interior of the tree. So you actually get more fruit on a tree if it has fewer branches, which seems counterintuitive. It's also a way to control size. If you're wanting your tree to be smaller than it naturally wants to be, pruning is one of the best ways to do that. And similarly, it can be a way to kind of rein in vigor. Like if the tree is just like growing too fast for whatever you're trying to do, pruning is a way to kind of slow that down. And also just to make it fit your situation. If you want to do like espalier, where you want to prune it so that it's flat up against a wall because that's all the space you have, you need to prune to make that happen, or you need to train to make that happen. If you have a branch that's like growing out into your driveway, you want to prune to make sure you're not hitting it with your car. So, there's lots of different reasons that we prune. And I think one of the biggest things that intimidates people about pruning is that they're always worried about what happens if they do it wrong. And I just want to assure you right now, here at the beginning, that that people have pruned trees for thousands of years. Like literally thousands of years. And these fruit trees have been grown across continents. A lot of different people, a lot of different cultures have pruned fruit trees, and I can assure you that they did not all do it exactly the same. Even if you talk to two like experienced fruit tree pruners, they're going to tell you a little different. And if you have tried to research fruit tree pruning, you have probably noticed this, that everyone will tell you something a little different. And that should tell you right there that there's a lot of ways to do it. That it's more important to prune and get kind of the general idea of it done than it is to make sure that you're doing every single little tiny thing right. And all those people that are pruning, they're still getting fruit. And so you don't need to be worried about making sure that you know exactly what you're doing from the get-go. These trees, like I said, they've been bred to almost need pruning. And so oftentimes it's better to prune, even if you think you're doing it wrong, than to not prune at all. Like if you're just like, I don't know exactly how to do it, so I'm just not going to prune this tree, I can almost assure you that tree is going to die or get diseases or break in a storm. Whereas if you prune it, even if you prune it poorly, you are probably going to get better results. And so the best thing to do is just dive in and do it, and just realize that you'll get better over time. And just two kind of extreme examples that I like to give about how different pruning can be is I'm going to tell you the way that we do it. And like I said, you probably won't do it exactly the way I tell you. As you prune over time, you're going to adapt and kind of get your own little style that you do. But there's like some that are even like really crazy. Like there's a pruning system in France where they make the fruit trees like weep. Like if you see like a weeping mulberry or a weeping willow or something where the branches kind of droop down, they actually train and bend the branches so that they droop down and they look like these really sad trees. But they swear that they get more fruit that way, and they have to prune it less. I've never done it. There's a woman who's doing some really cool research on traditional ways that peaches were grown in the Southwest by the Navajo, the Hopi, and the Zuni people. And they grow peaches as bushes. And so like not even kind of like how we prune peaches. And they were considered some of the best peaches in the world. And so like, again, there's lots of different ways to do this. And so just, I hope you take comfort in that, because you don't need to make sure that you're doing it exactly the way that a specific book tells you. So when we're talking about training, then, if I'm saying, oh, we're pruning to train, or we can bend them or whatever, all these different things, what are we actually training to? What is the goal? So generally speaking, when we're talking about trees, shrubs and vines and stuff are a different story. But when we're talking about trees, there are three main kind of training systems. There's the central leader, the modified central leader, and the open vase or open center. And we're going to talk about each one of these specifically. But for all of them, the kind of the commonality between all of them is you usually want a pretty clear trunk. You don't want branches coming off your trunk until about 3 feet off the ground. That's the ideal. Trees are living things. You're not always going to get the ideal. You're not making this. It's growing. It's a living thing. And so if it's, a little bit below that, it's not the end of the world, but you don't usually want branches growing, a foot off the ground, because if they droop or they get, weight from fruit, they're going to be just laying on the ground, which is not great. So usually you want a clear trunk for about 3 feet before your first branches for all 3 of these training systems. So the first one we're going to talk about is central leader. So this is by far the most common training system for a lot of the fruit that most people think about and that people plant most commonly here. So this is the type of training system you're going to do for pretty much all apples, European pears, Asian pears, pawpaw, jujube, which isn't that common, but is one that we like, European plum, and pecan. So with a central leader, I always like to say that the kind of ideal of a central leader, like if you're like trying to get in your mind, like what's the idea of a central leader? Imagine a fake Christmas tree. Like the idea of a central leader is that you've got a real straight trunk that just shoots straight up through the middle of the tree. So like you can see on this picture, just straight up. And then you have what are called scaffold rings. So you have branches that are growing pretty close to each other, but that are pointing out in all different directions. Again, kind of like you would see on like a fake Christmas tree. So, usually 3 to 5 limbs in a scaffold ring. So like here you can see these 4, it's kind of hard with a drawing, but you can kind of imagine that this is like pointing in 4 different directions, that you've got these 4 branches. And then you have a gap that's relatively clear. And then you've got another scaffold ring, about like 18 inches or so up. And then you repeat that basically until you get to the top of the tree. Again, like kind of like a fake Christmas tree. So you've got that like clear gap between, and those scaffold rings, the branches coming out of that are called scaffold limbs. And so those usually are going to get shorter the higher you go up. So again, you can kind of see that on this, where these are long, these are a little shorter. If you had another ring up here, those are going to be a little bit shorter. And so you get that kind of classic kind of conifer shape. Your tree's not going to look like that. I mean, it's not going to look like a Christmas tree because it's not a Christmas tree, but that's kind of like in your head, that's the basic idea of what you're going for. And again, that's what you're going to be trying to get when you're growing things kind of on this list here. So kind of on the opposite side, although still related, is the open vase. So open vase is primarily designed to control vigor. So when you have fruit trees that are really incredibly fast growing, those are usually the ones that you're going to use an open vase for. So here in St. Louis, peach is the main one that we're talking about when we're talking about open vase. That's really the only one that I say like absolutely you want to do open vase for. There's an almond hybrid that we grow here called Reliable that's really cool, that you also do the same concept of an open vase, but then you don't prune it after you get those initial scaffold rings. So it's not even really kind of related to what we're talking about, but it technically fits in this category. Apricots usually don't do real great here. And so we usually say that you do the modified central leader, which is what we're going to talk about next, if you're going to grow those. And then plums that aren't European plums, you would do an open vase. And then with a tart cherry, you can do an open vase to make it easier to pick them because they stay lower. Although you can also do a modified central leader on those. So with an open vase, again, same idea where you have no branches until about 3 feet off the ground. And then you get that scaffold ring. So those kind of 3 to 5 limbs, but like 4-ish branches that are pointing in, relatively different directions. And then you chop off the central leader. So there's no middle. And so what that helps with is, again, like with controlling vigor. So peaches can grow just crazy fast. So if you look at this tree here on the left, you can see, these big, thick branches. So these are the scaffolds. And you can see there's some thicker branches that kind of come off here that have been around for a couple of years. But you see that most of the growth on here are these little, really thin twigs. So the reason that these are so thin is this is 1 year's growth. These little tiny things that you can see are like several feet long is 1 year's growth. And so if you imagine, if you did a central leader here and it was growing like this every year, your peaches would be like 20 feet off the ground. And how do you pick a peach that way? Because you can't like use the little picker baskets very well because they're soft, they get all smashed. And so the open vase helps make it easier for you to physically grab the peaches, either from the ground or from a step ladder. And so it just makes your life a lot easier. And we'll talk a little bit more about peaches specifically at the very end because they're a little odd. But that's the open vase idea. So then the modified central leader is kind of in the middle. So modified central leader is for things that are vigorous, but not as vigorous as as like a peach. So there are some apples that do better with a modified central leader. There's some pears. There's not many. You really, I mean, for the most part, you're doing central leader on those. But this is what you're going to see with things like persimmons. This is usually what you would do with tart cherries, chestnuts, walnuts, and you could also do jujubes this way. But modified central leader is also so it's the idea that you get that kind of straight trunk, but at some point usually they're going to kind of lose vigor, or they'll kind of reach their height, at which point you can kind of stop worrying about keeping that stick straight trunk. Oftentimes then like the leader will just kind of like move over to the side and be more like a lateral branch, like a scaffold branch. And you can just kind of let it do that. So modified central leader is just kind of in the middle, where you don't have the central leader at the top, but it's not an open vase where you're like chopping it off real short to the ground. So when we're pruning and we're thinking about, oh, we need to like get these structures, another important thing when you're particularly when you're thinking about those scaffold branches, is what's called branch angle. So that's the angle where you've got your trunk that should be straight in pretty much all of them, unless you're at like the top of a modified central leader, but we're pretty much going to be straight. And then the angle, from like, if this is 0 degrees, what angle is that scaffold branch coming off the trunk? The ideal is somewhere between like 45 degrees and like 60-ish, but really I say anywhere from 45 to 90 is fine. And there's even some people like that French pruning system that I told you about, where they specifically want it greater than 90 degrees. And so really, as long as it's over 45 degrees, you're fine. But normally like the conventional wisdom says like 45 to 60 degrees, but you do want to make sure that it's not less than 45 degrees. And you don't need like a protractor out there to like make sure if it's 44 degrees or something. These are approximates, but you don't want it to be like real narrow, because if you have less than that, it can cause major problems. It doesn't always, but it can sometimes cause huge problems. And the reason for that is because or you can see it here. So, if you get this is like, 45-ish degree angle, that these two are meeting. And if you cut the branch, kind of vertically, this way where you can see the wood, you can see that this wood is merged together. It's fused together, that this is wood all the way through, pure wood. And so that's a nice solid anchoring, that they're connected. They are fused together. That branch is not going anywhere unless there is like a massive amount of stress on that tree. Whereas if you look at this, where you've got, a very small angle between the branches, so a very narrow branch angle, when you cut that vertically, if you look, you can see here, there's this kind of brown, black kind of line in between here. That's where the bark actually got pinched in between. It was, the bark on these two branches, as the trees got bigger, it wasn't able to push it out because it wasn't wide enough. And so the bark literally just got stuck in there. And so this isn't fused together at all. Like from the outside, it looks like it's fused together, but it's not. And so if you look at this, none of this is actually anchoring this branch. So as this branch gets bigger and bigger, and especially if you've got fruit on it, it's getting heavier and heavier. You're getting more and more weight pulling on no more wood. There's no more wood as the tree gets bigger. It's the same amount of wood as when it was really little. And so eventually what usually is going to happen is you're going to get that fruit on it, especially if we get a big storm, it's just going to split. It's just going to split right in half. And you have seen this before, I can almost assure you, from Bradford pears. It's one of the reasons why Bradford pears are so terrible in terms of structural strength, is because the branches just grow straight up. Their branch angles are really narrow. And so when you get a big storm, they just split, they just crack, because they're not actually anchored to each other. Those branches aren't anchored. And you can get stuff like this. And you can see this on a fruit tree too. Like I've seen this on peaches in particular, where the peaches weren't at a good angle, or there was a middle to it, and it was a mess. And you can see it on them too, if you've ever noticed, or as you see more Bradford pears fail in the future, which we will continue to see as long as people plant them. You usually, when they split, you'll see this dark coloring, and again, that's that bark that's stuck in there. That either the bark or the remnants of that bark, the rotting of it, as it decomposes, and that's what's happening. Whereas on the other hand, if you think about, like if you drive out across the Great Plains, and you'll see, a tree like off in the distance that there's like no other trees around it. And you're like, how is that tree alive? There's like tornadoes through here all the time. It's super windy. And if you look at it, it's not growing like a Bradford pear. The branches are really far and wide, because that's how you get strong branches. That's how it has survived those storms, is because it has really good, strong branch connections, because it has those wide angles. There's also, genetics involved in it too. Like certain trees are just stronger than others, but that structure is really critical for that. So then how do you create that structure? Especially if you're talking about, well, if I've got two branches that are, really narrow, what am I supposed to do? So you can do what's called limb spreading. So this is, again, really helpful if you have branches that the angles are too narrow. You'll see that a lot in pears. Bradford pears grow that way because pears just tend to grow that way. So if you're growing European pears or Asian pears, but also apples, and it can happen in any trees, but particularly the pears, and then to a lesser degree the apples, you're going to get that, where you're going to get a lot of branches that are really narrow. They're wanting to grow, just kind of straight up. And you can just kind of bend those branches down. Fruit tree branches tend to be pretty flexible, usually because they're growing so fast. The wood is just really bendy. And so if you get it when it's small, it's really easy to just bend it where you want it. And that can just be straight down, or you can also like move it over to the side. They're really pretty flexible. And there's a couple different ways to do that. The way that we like the most is there's these limb spreaders like this, these kind of red plastic ones that you can buy already made. They come in various lengths. They're really handy. It's a UV stabilized plastic, so they don't last forever, but they will last for quite a while outside. But you can also make your own. There's people that'll just take thin wood like lath, or 1x2s or 1x3s or something like that, and cut little notches in them. You can also just take like a piece of wire, or like this is like a board with like nails in the end or something, and if you've got two branches, you just pull one down to where you want it, and then you just wedge something in between it. That's all there is to it. But you can also, kind of do it from the other end. Instead of kind of wedging to push it down, you can also just pull it down. So you could like tie a string around a branch and pull it down, and like put a stake in the ground, or tie it to like a big rock or a cinder block. If you have, a larger branch at the bottom that's like relatively secure, and you need to like pull down one further up, you could tie it to a lower branch. There's lots of different ways to do this, but you can bend those branches down if you need to kind of move, or again, pull it to the side. I've done that too, where I'll get a limb spreader in this way to kind of push it down, and then I'll tie a string and like stake it to like, so where it's like pushed down this way, and then take a string to like pull it over if I need a branch, just a little bit over this way to kind of have a more even spacing or something. Again, they're pretty pliable things. And also just with these, so usually you can put them in any time of year, but this is a perfect time to put them in when you're pruning, because if you put it in now before the growth has started in the spring, then in just the next couple weeks, the next month or two, when the tree is growing, that kind of new ring of growth, like the rings of a tree you count, so they put on a new ring of growth. That ring is going to be then in the shape that you've forced that branch to be. So especially if the branch is young, if you put it in now and it gets that new ring of growth on, you can take that limb spreader out by like midsummer, and it'll be just locked in place. If you wait until midsummer to put it in, then you'll probably have to have it in like a full year, because you'll need to wait for next spring's growth ring to kind of lock it in place. But yeah, and you also don't need to go all the way in 1 year. If you like pull it down and it's like starting to like, it's hard, it's getting tension on it, you're like a little worried that you're going to break it, then put it there, and then next year pull it a little further, because it'll like lock it in place in that way. And so it then becomes more flexible to pull it down, and then stick a bigger limb spreader in. Like it doesn't all need to be at once. Again, trees live a long time. You don't need to be in a big hurry. Another great tool for getting the right structure is bamboo. You can also use anything straight, but bamboo is a really great material because it stays really straight, it's really strong, and it's light, which can be really helpful if your tree is flexible. And so this can be really great for maintaining the central leader. So if your tree is kind of growing up and then the central leader wants to kind of move over to the side, jujubes are notorious for this, that they'll kind of grow and be nice and straight, and then they just like flop over. They'll just like be a shepherd's hook. So to keep it straight, what you can do is, if you've got it, like this, if you tie a bamboo pole to the bottom part of the trunk that's straight, and then it's tied here, the bamboo isn't going to bend. If you bend bamboo, it just breaks. So it's not going to bend. And then you take the central leader that's kind of flopped over and you pull it up, and then you tie it to that bamboo. It's going to hold it straight, which is what you're seeing in this picture here. So like down here where the trunk is big, it's already straight. You secure the bamboo pole there so that it's locked in a straight position, and then you just tie the central leader to it as it goes, to make sure that it's growing in that nice straight position for you. Another nice thing, especially when the tree is really young, can just be like T-posts or stakes. So you can just like stick a stake in the ground of bamboo or metal to get the trunk growing straight, especially if you're transplanting it. They can kind of like tilt in the soil a little bit, and you want it to be straight. So you can do that either by sticking a stake right in the ground at the base and kind of tying it to it, or you can do kind of what you see here. The picture is a bit grainy, but these are little apples. We haven't put the wire on them yet because you can see this one's still leaning a little bit. But if you put a stake on each side, and then you put wire or string or whatever you got between it to kind of hold the tree upright so it's straight, that's another great way when the trees are young to get them growing in the right direction for you. So once you do all of that, which most people don't talk about that, everybody jumps to the pruning. Once you do that, then you're going to be pruning. Like once you make sure, all right, I've got my central leader, I've got my scaffold branches, like you've kind of identified, like these are the ones that I know I want to keep, then everything else is potentially on the chopping block. And so when we're talking about pruning, we want to make sure that we have the right tools for it. So hand pruners are your most critical tool. It's what you're going to be using the most frequently, especially if you're pruning your trees like from day one, which you should be. Most of the pruning cuts you're going to make are going to be on pretty small branches, and hand pruners are the way to do that. So this style of pruners, where it's kind of like a scissors type action, they're called bypass pruners, is really what you want. There's also anvil pruners, which is where there's like a straight thing and then like a blade that kind of like hits it. You don't want those. If you have those and you are able to just throw those away and get bypass pruners, do it. If anvil pruners is all you got and you can't get bypass, go for it. But bypass pruners are much better. They get a much cleaner cut. They do less damage to the wood. They're easier to sharpen. Like they last longer usually. By anvil pruners, the problem is if that thing that is hitting it gets dull and you sharpen it, it's then not hitting it anymore because it's shorter. And so they're more disposable. They're just not as good of tools. For bigger branches, you can use loppers. So these big old things. For really large branches, especially if you're doing if you have a existing large fruit tree that you're trying to get back into shape and you're needing to cut big branches, you really are going to need a saw of some kind. There's lots of different things you can use, but do yourself a favor and go spend the $10 to $20 on what's called a limbing saw, like as in the limb of a tree, limbing. And it'll look something like this. They either fold in half or they're a rigid saw with like a sheath, usually, that they'll go in. They just cut through tree branches so much better than any other hand saw. They will just make your life much, much easier. It is well worth the investment. And then you're also going to need, I like alcohol, but anything to sanitize with. You can also use like a bleach solution or iodine, but I like rubbing alcohol because it's not going to bleach my clothes or stain my clothes like bleach or iodine would do if I spill it. And then a rag, or if your alcohol has a spray, like a spray nozzle on it, that'll work as well. Just something to spread the alcohol onto your pruners to sanitize them, which brings us to sanitation. So all cutting edges, so especially like on your pruners, your loppers, it's a little harder to do on a saw. Excuse me, but all your cutting edges, you want to sanitize between each tree. So like when you start out on the day, if you've got more than one tree, or even if you just have one tree, when you start out at the beginning, you want to sanitize your pruning, the cutting surfaces of your pruners, your loppers, your saw, whatever it is you're using. And you want to do that to make sure that if there's any diseases on those blades, that when you cut it, you're not introducing a pathogen to an open wound. Like, you don't want to do that, for the same reason that if you get a cut, you want to clean it. You don't want to be getting germs into open wounds. And if there is a disease that, and you want to then resanitize anytime you move from tree to tree. So if you're cutting your first tree and then you're going to move to your next one, sanitize those blades before you move to the next one, again, to make sure that if there was a disease on that first tree, you're not going to then spread it to the second one. If there's an active disease in the tree, like if you know that there is a disease like fire blight, like, which is where like the bark is charred black, and I mean, you can look up pictures of it. Like if your tree has fire blight and you're cutting that out, you should, and it's a pain to do, but you should be sanitizing those cuts between those cutting surfaces between every single cut that you do. That's because, especially with fire blight, it's not, it's just in the tissue that's infected. It's not systemic, like where it's not like if it's on this branch, that doesn't mean that it's over on this branch over here. And so if you cut it here and you cut it out and you get fire blight on your pruners, and then you come over here to healthy branch and you cut it, you very well could have just introduced fire blight to that branch, and you don't want to do that, because then you're just going to have to come back and cut that out. And if you didn't sanitize, then you're just going to be reintroducing and reintroducing and reintroducing until there's no tree left. So if you see an active disease, you want to sanitize between that. And then when you are pruning anything that you're cutting off the tree, you want to remove that from the orchard. Like you shouldn't be leaving it laying around on the ground. You shouldn't be heaping it up in a pile next to the orchard. It should be removed from the orchard. Like you should either burn it, you should put it in the yard waste, you should chip it up and like use it as mulch, somewhere else, not by the orchard, because those prunings could have disease on them. They could have eggs of pest insects on them. And so it's just good sanitation, good pest and disease management practices to remove those from the orchard in some way. If you're cutting out fire blight specifically, those should be burned or thrown in the garbage. Like those should not be chipped. Those should not be kept anywhere around your trees. It's a bacterial disease. The only way to kill it is fire or getting it away from you. I mean, I think you can also bury it, but like you'd have to like dig a big hole and bury it, and that's a lot of work. So when you are cutting the tree, when you are pruning it, there's two main types of cuts that you could do. There's a thinning cut, which is where you're removing the entire branch, and there's a heading cut where you're just removing part of a branch. So, tipping or like a heading cut would be, if you've got this whole branch and you're just cutting off like the top half of it. Whereas thinning, as you can see here, is where you're like removing whole, branch segments. For a thinning cut where you're removing the whole branch, it's important to know where to cut. So the only important thing to know, or the main important thing to know, is there's this thing called the branch collar. I mean, the name is not important, but where a branch meets whatever it is that it's joining to, whether that's another branch or the trunk of the tree, you're usually going to see this kind of flare here, where it's not like a straight angle. There's kind of this like gentle kind of curve, and that kind of curved area is called the branch collar. So that is where the tree is going to grow over and cover that wound. And so you don't want to cut into that, because if you cut into that, it's going to slow and it's going to stifle that kind of healing process that the tree goes through. And you don't want to do that. You want it to heal over as quickly as possible, so there's less of an issue of disease or rot or other things that could set in. And so you just want to cut just like right outside that branch collar. You don't want to cut way out here, because then you've got this big old stub of wood that has no purpose and is just a spot for potentially problems to present themselves. So you want to cut close to that branch collar, but not into it. And we don't really need to talk about that, the 3-cut technique. For a heading cut, when you're just, or tipping, it can be called too, where you're just cutting off kind of the tip of a branch. The most important thing to know is you want to cut just kind of above a bud, ideally. So you'll see a bud on the branch. It's the little bumps that you'll usually see, like it looks like a little leaf or something forming. So that's a bud. And you want to look where those are, and you want to cut, like this here. So you don't want to cut, where like the bud's sticking up above, because that's really close. You don't want to leave, a big stub. You want to cut, just kind of like this. And like there's not like an exact number, but it's just, a general idea. You don't want to leave a big stub above the bud. You don't want to cut too close. You want to go just right. And the reason for that is wherever you cut, that like that bud at the end of that branch is what's going to make a new branch. That's where it's going to grow out. And so it's important to pay attention to that bud. And you want to select the bud that is facing away from the trunk. So, it's like, as you can see in this picture here, you've got the trunk, you've got the branch coming out here. If you selected a bud, like in this picture, where like the bud is facing to the, to the right, away from this trunk, then in the spring, once it leaves out, you're going to get this new branch that's going to shoot out this way, away from the trunk. And it's going to be more horizontal. So you're going to get kind of that nice, again, wide structure that you want. So then, what are you actually cutting off? When you talk about like what you're actually looking for in terms of what are you removing, the first thing to know, and this is the easiest one, is you want to remove all root suckers. So fruit trees, for the most part, are what's called grafted. So it's actually the root of one tree and the top of another tree that they stick together, they grow together, and that's how you get your fruit tree. That's how almost all fruit trees are grown. And it's why when you get a young fruit tree, you'll usually see a shape like this. That weird kind of like zigzag is where the graft happened. So everything below that it's called the graft union, kind of where they were together. Everything below that is what's called the root stock. And that root stock is not what you want to have leafy stuff above ground, but it will sometimes send up shoots. And if you let that grow, if it produces fruit, it's not going to be at all what you bought, because what you purchased in terms of like, oh, I bought a, Gala apple or whatever it is that you bought is what is this top wood. And so that's what you want to be producing leaves, is this top wood. And so if you're getting growth from stuff below that graft union, and oftentimes you'll see it just literally coming up out of the ground, you want to remove that. You want to cut it all the way down to the soil surface or back to the trunk. Otherwise you can get something like this. If you let the root suckers grow and you don't cut them off, you can get, kind of a monstrosity like this, where it's growing like a shrub. And all of this stuff that is coming up from the roots is not going to produce the fruit that you want. So you want to remove those. And you can do that actually any time of year. Pretty much all the other pruning you're going to be doing like now, like end of February into March, but root suckers you can do any time of year. But if you missed some last year, this is a great time to get that done. You're also going to want to remove any branch or wood that is broken, damaged, or diseased, because if it's already broken, damaged, or diseased, it's probably just going to get worse over time. And so you might as well just remove it now so that the tree can invest its energy into a branch that is not broken, damaged, or diseased. When you're talking about your central leader, if it's the shape that you want a central leader, you're going to want to make sure that you remove any branches that are like trying to become a leader along with it. So it's called like a competing leader or a double leader. And you can see something like this, where, this one here on the left is probably what was originally the leader, but this branch started, shooting up, and they're kind of now getting more of like kind of a Y shape, and you don't want that. So if you can't bend this down so that it's, horizontal or growing kind of in a scaffold ring that you want it to be, just cut it off, all the way back to the trunk, or to the branch collar. And then anything with like an unusually narrow angle. So I don't know, like, if you see something like this where it's not really competing with the leader, but it's kind of growing up and it's got a real narrow angle, just chop it off if you don't need a branch there, because you've already kind of got this branch here. Why keep it? Another thing you're going to want to remove is anything that's growing straight up or anything that's growing straight down, or, pretty close to straight up or straight down. So straight up is usually going to be, it's called a water sprout. That's usually what people are talking about when they're talking about water sprouts. And that is a purely vegetative branch. It's only going to produce leaves. As long as it is growing straight up like that, it will never produce fruit. There's like hormonal signals that trees have. If it's growing straight up, it's not producing fruit for you. And so if you can't bend it down, if you don't need a branch, wherever you could bend it down, chop it off. There's no reason to keep something that's just going to produce a lot of leaves, because if it's growing straight up, it's going to be growing up into a scaffold ring above it. Or if it's on the top scaffold ring, it's going to be competing with your central leader. And so you don't want that. You want that structure. And it's also, I mean, by growing straight up, it's also going to be shaded, which means it's not going to produce fruit for you. It's going to be restricting airflow into the middle of the canopy, which you don't want. And again, eventually it's going to probably hit a branch above it, which you also don't want. You don't want branches rubbing up against each other, which we'll talk about. And then anything that's growing kind of straight down out of the bottom of a branch, which you don't see very often, but you do see sometimes, you also want to remove, because again, if it's growing directly below a branch, it's probably not going to be getting any sunlight. And so it's not going to be producing any fruit. And so just get rid of them. So another thing that you want to be removing is anything that's growing inwards. So if you've got, branches like this, and you've got, like with the trunk in the middle, and you've got a branch kind of going this way, remove that. Because again, if it's growing in, it's probably going to be shaded. It's probably going to run into a branch or the trunk at some point, and then you're going to have rubbing branches, which you don't want. So just chop them off. And then any rubbing branches. So, if you've got, if you're removing all the things that we talked about before, and you've got two branches that are hitting each other, that are rubbing. So like you can see this one that's like kind of growing over and is hitting this, I don't know, this is like a shrub or something, but like hitting this kind of trunk. What happens is when you get wind and stuff, those two branches are going to be rubbing against each other. And just like with you, if you have skin that's like rubbing up against each other all the time, or like, your shoe, like your foot like rubbing in your shoe, you're going to get blisters, you're going to get rashes. Your skin doesn't like that, and that's a great entry point for disease. And it's the same with trees and shrubs. If the branches are rubbing, you're going to cause damage to the branch, and that's a great spot for disease to get introduced to your tree, which you don't want. So if you've got two branches that are rubbing up against each other, one of those branches, it either needs to be bent so that it is not rubbing up against the tree, or it needs to be removed. You don't want two branches rubbing up against each other. And that's the thing too, that you can also look, and I mean, you can kind of see where a branch is growing. And if you can see like, oh, this is gonna run into this branch as it gets bigger, well, then remove it now. Like there's no reason for the tree to invest energy in a branch that you're gonna remove in 2 years. So, if you can see that coming, if you can see, oh, that's just gonna run into this branch over here, then just go ahead and remove it now. And those last, things that we talked about, like those are kind of the critical things, or the important things to think about. Beyond that, pruning is just thinning. If you look in your tree, like, oh, you've got a great structure, there's nothing growing straight up, there's nothing growing straight down. You've removed everything that's growing inwards, there's no branches that are rubbing up against each other. If you've kind of done all of that, and the tree still looks kind of thick, like there's still branches, shading each other, then just start removing branches to thin it out. And you want to usually start at the top, because, if you start at the top, then there might not be shade. If you start from the bottom, you could be cutting things that then later, when you cut something higher up, wouldn't have been in the shade. So you start at the top, move your way down. But if you remove all those other things first, and the branches that are left aren't shaded, then you're done. But you do also want to make sure that you're not removing more than about 30% of branches in a year, except for peaches, where you can remove up to 50% in a year because they're so crazy vigorous. So also, if you're going through these priorities and you're like, oh, I did the first two and I've removed like a lot of wood already on the tree, well, then you can't prune anymore. But then keep that in mind. So then like next year, you'll prune a little bit more, especially if your tree hasn't been pruned in a while. It might take a couple years to kind of get it to that structure, and that's fine. It doesn't all need to happen at once, because if you're like, I need to get everything done, and you remove 60% of the tree in 1 year, the tree might be so shocked by that it might die. And then it doesn't matter if the structure is good. So just kind of move through those rules and work your way through it. So just to kind of review for trees, the first thing is you want to identify the needed structure. So figure out, if I've got an apple, I need a central leader pruning system. If I've got a peach, I need an open base. So kind of identify that. And then, look at your tree and identify, where is the central leader? What of these branches could be my scaffold branches? And if your scaffold branch is, not in the right spot, spread it, if you're able to. And kind of identify those things that you want to keep. And then once you know what you're going to keep, then look at your tree, remove all the root suckers, remove any broken, damaged, or diseased branches, remove any of those double leaders, remove anything that's growing straight up or straight down, remove any branches that are growing, inward toward the center of the tree, remove any branches that are rubbing or will be rubbing in the near future. And then if the tree looks really dense, then you can just kind of thin it. You can just kind of prune out branches here and there. If you've got 2 or 3 branches that are growing pretty close to each other, then cut out the middle one or cut out 2 of the 3, until the branches that are left have got plenty of sun. And you got to kind of imagine what they would look like with leaves on them, but just kind of go through and thin it out. So then at the end here, I just want to go through a couple kind of other pruning things that you would do, or a couple kind of specialty or kind of exception things. So peaches, like I mentioned, they're extra vigorous. So, for your apples, your pears, your jujubes, your pecan, all those different things that you'd be pruning, you don't want to remove any more than 30%. Peaches, you can remove, 40 to 50% every single year. Like you will want to be removing that much every single year. They require more pruning than any other tree. So if you're like thinking about what trees do I want to plant and you don't like pruning, don't plant a peach. And the reason that they need, or one of the reasons that they need so much pruning, is that they only produce fruit on last year's wood. So if you're not pruning the tree and the tree just gets bigger and bigger, last year's wood is going to be at the end of the branches. And so the fruit is again just going to be on the tips of the branches. And as the branches get bigger, as they get wider, as they get longer, the fruit is going to be on the end of those longer and longer branches. And that puts more and more stress on the tree. So if you think about, like if you hold like 2 gallons of milk and you're holding them like right up here by your chest, they might be heavy, but they don't feel super heavy. Versus if you hold those exact 2 gallons of milk, the exact same weight, and you hold your arms outright, it's a lot harder to hold them, even though it's the exact same amount of weight. And it's the same on the tree. I mean, it's the same amount of like extra stress on those like shoulder joints on the tree. And so it's more likely for a branch to fail. And so you're kind of identifying those scaffold branches. And then every year you're going to be pruning, like other than the scaffolds, you're going to be pruning off any of the old kind of gray colored shoots. So the shoots from like 2 years ago, you're going to be just completely chopping them off. And last year's growth is really easy to tell last year's growth because it has like an orange peachy kind of color. So you can see in this picture how there's these kind of 4 scaffold branches that are gray. You can see them kind of go up at that gray color. And then you can see all the other branches on here are this kind of peach color. So that's last year's growth. So those is where you're cutting like 50% of that off, of that like peach growth. And you can just shorten them, or you can remove a whole branch. If there's a bunch of branches that are growing really close to each other, like in a cluster, cut down to where it's just one. And then that one that's left, like cut it down so it's like 12 inches or shorter. So peaches are they need more pruning. It's not hard. It's not a harder pruning or anything. There's just more cuts being done. For shrubs, if you have like fruiting shrubs, really the only like every single year pruning you need to do is you want to remove any damaged, disease, or broken branches. Once the shrub is kind of to its mature size, you just like every year, it's usually a good idea to go in and just kind of remove like one big mature branch. So that you kind of have a rotation, so that there's always new growth coming into the shrub. Because usually if a tree gets mature and then you just let it do its thing and don't really prune it at all, usually the fruit production will kind of decline. So if there's like 6 trunks or 6 main branches on the shrub, then like cut one out, and then the next year or 2 years later cut another one out, and just let it kind of slowly regenerate in that way is usually a good practice. If you're growing elderberries or figs, the easiest pruning to do on them is you just cut them all the way down to the ground every winter, and they will grow back and produce fruit every single year if you do that. And so it's much easier than trying to prune it in a fancy way. If you have cane fruits, so these are things like raspberries and blackberries, there's 2 different kind of bearing types of blackberries and raspberries. So there's what are called primocane bearers or ever bearers or fall bearers. They're all the same thing. If you have a variety that says one of those 3 things, then you can cut them completely down to the ground every year. and they will regrow and produce fruit that following fall. And so especially if you have a fall bearing blackberry or raspberry that has thorns on it, it's really nice to be able to just cut them down and not have to be like tangling through the thorns to figure out what to cut and what not to cut. So if you have one of those, just cut them all the way down to the ground, make your life easy. If you have one that does not say that, so most are not in that category, but if you have one that does not say that, what you're going to do this time of year is you're going to cut out all of the branches. They're called canes because it's a cane fruit. So the individual cane or individual branch only lives 2 years. So if it is not an everbearer, the first year that cane will not produce any fruit. The second year it will, and then after it produces fruit, it dies. So any branch that produced fruit last year, cut it down. It's usually pretty easy to tell if it produced fruit because you'll see like the little nubs from the fruit still on the branch. Just chop it all the way down to the ground and remove it. And then once you do that, all of the canes that are left, any side branching, cut those side branches down to about 12 inches, which just makes harvesting a lot easier. So you can see like this picture here where, you've got these big long side branches, you cut them down to like 12 inches and it just makes it easier, especially if they have thorns, to get in there and pick the fruit that's in the middle of the bramble of the bush. If you have vine crops, unfortunately, I'm just going to tell you to watch our vine crop class. We have it posted on our YouTube channel from last year. Vine crops are just kind of a completely different animal. If you have grapes or hardy kiwis, check out that class. And we've got some good step-by-step instructions on that. And then the last thing to know, this isn't pruning, but I just always like to remind people that this time of year also, once they leaf out, they will probably flower. Even if they're really small, they will probably still flower. But you do not want the trees to produce fruit until at least their third spring in the ground. And the reason for that is the tree thinks it's older than it is because of that grafting system that we use. And so the tree thinks that it's an adult, but it's not. And so it doesn't really have the energy resources. It doesn't really have the physical structure to hold the weight of the fruit when they're really young like that. And so if you let it produce fruit in those first 2 years, generally what happens is the tree is going to be stunted. It puts so much energy into producing that fruit that it then it makes the tree grow slower, kind of for the rest of its life, but especially for the first couple years. And so you actually get less fruit over the life of the tree if you let it produce fruit the first couple years. And the easiest way to prevent it from producing fruit is, or what I like to do, is let it bloom. And then, a week or two after it blooms, you'll see where some of the flowers were, not all of them, you'll see little itty bitty tiny like pea-sized fruit start forming, and they'll get bigger and bigger. And once you start seeing those little pea-sized fruit, just pop them off. They pop off really easy. Some people will pick off the flower blooms. You can do that too, but not all of them are going to get pollinated, so it's more work. Like you're picking off more things, and the flowers are pretty. So I usually let them flower. And I always like to tell people too that this idea that like they should be removed the first couple years has been it's been studied at extension services. It's been studied at research facilities all around the world, and it's also traditional knowledge. We know for a fact that this has been done for at least 3,500 years because it's written in the book of Leviticus that you shouldn't let your trees produce fruit, which was written at least 3,500 years ago. So we know that this is a thing that people have been doing for literally thousands of years, that people recognize that this was dwarfing the trees, that not allowing them to produce fruit the first couple of years to get them established meant more fruit in the long term. This is a well-established thing that is worth your time, even though it's a bummer to not get fruit the first couple of years. It's worth it. And then if your trees are old enough that they can start producing fruit, usually that's year 4 or 5 is usually when you start getting a decent amount of fruit. You're going to want to actually thin that fruit because you're probably going to get more fruit on there than the tree can really handle if you want nice big fruit. And so you're wanting to kind of thin those down, and you'll get larger fruit that way. You also usually get fewer pest issues if you thin your fruit. And so that's once the fruit starts forming, you would thin it. I usually use that as a spacing But the general rule is like 5 inches between fruit for apples, 8 inches between fruit for peaches. But I just use my hand. Obviously, everybody's hand is different, but again, it doesn't need to be exact, and it's much easier to do that than try and like have a ruler out there. And if you had this branch and there was another peach in here, you just pop it off when it was little, and then that means that the peaches that are left are going to get much bigger, which means that you get a lot more food actually, because the reason that the tree is producing fruit is to spread the seed, which you're not eating. So the peach pit is not going to be any smaller if the tree doesn't have energy. It's just the flesh that's going to be less on each individual peach. So if you have 2 peaches where the peach is bigger, you actually have more food than if you had 3 smaller peaches, because it's going to invest the money or the energy, the resources to produce a full-size pit in all 3 of those. And then with whatever energy it has left over, it's going to make more of the actual fruit that you want. So just as you're thinking about training and pruning your trees, you just want to remember your goals. You want a strong, healthy tree, because a strong, healthy tree produces nice, healthy fruit. That's what you want. And you do that by creating a strong physical structure so that it can take the wind and the weight of the fruit, and so that you get that nice airflow. And so that's why we prune and train our trees. We are not hurting the trees. We are making sure that the branches that we leave at the end of pruning and training are as strong and disease resistant as possible, so that we get as much food as possible. And I like to point out that the reason that there's this picture of a crazy cat on here is because there's an old time saying that you'll hear people say, and there's lots of different variants of it, but they'll say something along the lines of, when you're done pruning, your tree should be open enough that some sort of animal can fly through or be thrown through the tree without getting caught on a branch. And one of the sayings is you should be able to throw a cat through the tree without it being able to grab a branch. Not sure why we're throwing cats, but that's like an old saying that people used to say about apple trees specifically, that you can find in like some old books every once in a while. So that is the basics of dormant fruit tree pruning. And it looks like I have a lot of questions here that I'm happy to answer. But yeah, if you do not have any questions, you are of course welcome to go. Like I said, this is all recorded, and I will be we'll be posting that to our YouTube channel, and I'll email all of you that attended once that's up. All right, so questions. Does this apply to citrus and lemon trees as well? I bring mine in every year, but I'm not having luck with fruit yet. Plenty of flowers though. So I mean, pruning can definitely help with citrus. I mean, they're usually, if you're growing them in pots, they're going to be more kind of shrubby. So like the actual structure is not as important, just because they're usually much smaller. But you are going to want to be pruning for to make sure that there's good airflow. In terms of fruit set, I'm almost certain what's causing that is lack of pollination. If they're flowering, citrus usually flowers in the winter. If they're inside when they're flowering, there's nothing to pollinate them unless you have a bunch of bees in your house. They're really easy to self-pollinate. You just like take your finger or like a little paintbrush or something and just stick it in the flower, and then move it over to another flower and stick your finger in that, and just do that between all the flowers. I used to have a lemon tree for a while that I had the same issue. Didn't produce fruit, started hand pollinating it, got fruit. So I'm imagining that's what's happening. Where do we find out how to grow trees as bushes like the indigenous people in the Southwest? There really is not good resources on that. There is a woman who wrote about that with peaches. The problem with growing fruit trees as shrubs is that if you're buying a fruit tree, it's grafted, and if you cut it to try and grow it as a shrub, you're just going to get rootstock. So really the only way to grow a fruit tree like that as a shrub would be to either grow it from seed, at which case you usually don't know what you're going to get. Some things like peaches you can grow from seed because they're more self-pollinating, or if you're able to like root your own cuttings, which again is something that you would have to like figure out how to do yourself. Nobody really sells those, unfortunately. But there is a woman, her first name is Reagan. I cannot remember her last name, so that's not very helpful. But she works for the extension agency in Utah now, but she's a member of the Navajo Nation. And she has she wrote her thesis on this that talks a little bit about how they grew peaches as shrubs, that you can find online. If you just like Google around, Navajo peaches, Reagan, I don't know, just kind of like play around with the words, you should be able to find it on there. So somebody said Japanese plum is best with open base. Yeah, if you're going to do a plum, like a Japanese plum, that's usually what people say. I don't myself grow plums just because there's some bug issues. And so I don't have much experience pruning them myself, but that is from everything that I've heard from people who do grow them. Usually open base is a good way to get airflow, and because they can be really vigorous, so it's a good way to keep them kind of lower to the ground for you. Oh, what is the best pattern for pruning a mulberry tree? Pretty much whatever you want. Mulberries are pretty indestructible. I mean, they're essentially weeds, which I don't say as a derogatory term. I love that about them. Really, you can prune them to kind of whatever you want. I think probably modified central, like if you were picking a system, I think that's probably like what it would want to grow to, would be like a modified central leader. But if you wanted to keep it shorter to the ground, you could, just hack it back and do like an open vase, or just kind of prune it. A lot of the more like the less domesticated fruit trees, so things like mulberries and pawpaws and jujubes even, they really don't actually need much pruning, because they're wild enough that they still kind of do their own thing for the most part. They kind of know how to not crowd themselves out. They still have enough of that kind of wild genetics in them. So mulberries for the most part don't need much pruning, other than, if you've got branches that are in the way or broken or damaged or diseased or things like that, is what you're going to remove. The fruit weight isn't anywhere near as heavy, so you're not going to get as many issues in terms of that. And then crabapple would be kind of similar. I mean, you would stick to kind of like apple pruning, but because the weight isn't as much of an issue with most crab apples. I mean, if you're growing like a crab apple for cider or something, like where the fruit is bigger, it would be more important to do like central leader. But for if it's like an ornamental crab apple or something like that, it's more just about airflow, just kind of thinning out branches. So somebody asked about limb spreader in, so I imagine this came in before I talked about that, but if you put it in now, you would just need to leave it in until like midsummer. If you are doing a modified central leader and it looks like the leader branch is dying and branches near the leader are starting to die, do I need to cut again to get rid of any potential disease, or is this common in central leader trimming? If you have branches that are just like dying, just like a whole branch dying, if it's an apple or a pear or something, I would imagine you have fire blight and you want to cut that out. So yeah, if you have branches that are dying, you want to just cut that whole thing out. And then hopefully get some new growth going. Pruning at the summer solstice. So I do not prune at the summer solstice. There is a summer pruning that you can do, but that is more in like end of July into August. So when we get to that really hot, dry part of the season, the trees are kind of dormant as well. So like we think of this as being dormant, but when it's really hot and dry, the trees also go into summer dormancy, it's called. So that's when we prune those. Usually pruning around the summer solstice could put some more stress on the trees because they might still be actively growing. Like last year when it was like pretty mild still in June, the trees were still growing, and so pruning them, that would be a time that you could get introduction of disease. In other parts of the country, like I think like on the West Coast where it's hot and dry kind of all the time, they do more pruning around the solstice. And the thing with the solstice too is like if you prune before the solstice, you're going to get much more vigorous growth. If you prune after, because the days are shortening, you're not going to get as much growth, which is the idea of the summer pruning. Just with our specific climate here, we usually like to wait again until like late July, early August. The trees just usually respond a little better to that. Should you remove a third of new growth every year? Not necessarily. I mean, with peaches, like we talked about, yes, you should be removing new growth every year. With other trees, if you want the tree to keep growing in that way, like if you want it to be getting bigger, you don't need to remove any of the new growth unless it is a problem in one of those categories that we talked about. So like some people will talk about like, oh, you want to take every branch down by like 30%. I don't do that. I mean, there's sometimes like if I see a really long whippy branch, I mean, I will cut that, but I don't go through and cut every single branch. I don't ascribe to that. There are some people who do that though. And yes, somebody said they wanted to confirm that root suckers can be removed any time of year. Yes, they can. This is, like I said, this is a great time to remove them, but if you're seeing them pop up, especially like Asian pears are prone to this, and apples as well, where they will send up root suckers just over and over and over again when the tree is young. Just keep on removing them. There's no reason not to. For root suckers, just keep cutting them back. Somebody asked about dark spots on apples. So I would have to see a picture, but it is probably apple scab would be my guess, which is a really common kind of fungal disease of apples that are not resistant to it. There's a lot of really good immune apples that are immune to apple scab. If it is just like on the surface of the apple, like if you peel the apple and it looks fine on the inside, then it's apple scab, and there's no problem at all to that. You can eat it. You can eat it on the skin. It doesn't hurt you. It's not an issue. It's just a cosmetic problem. If it's like a rotten spot on the apple, I would have to see it, but that's probably a rot that's happening from a pest, either a worm or something, or a plum curculio that laid an egg, and then from that damage where that egg was laid, it started kind of rotting around that. Somebody asked about what shape works best for Bing cherries, central leader, vase, or modified. So tree cherries really can do any of the shapes. So generally speaking, I do not recommend sweet cherries for St. Louis because they do not usually like our soil. They like really well draining soil. But if you have one and it's growing fine, great. Then you found one that you found a spot that works. And so